Hello, you're watching Round Table. If you are not condemning Russia for what it's doing to Ukraine, then in the eyes of many in the West, you might just as well be supporting Moscow. Is that fair? Pressure to condemn Russia is mounting, with leaders in the US and Europe slapping sanctions on Moscow. And with those sanctions biting and multinationals now quitting Russia, Putin is feeling the pressure. But he's not entirely isolated. Why is India, for instance, the world's largest democracy, one of a number of nations reluctant to criticize Putin? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Yes, there is India, but there are others too.
A vote in the United Nations to condemn Putin. 141 countries voted to do that in the UN General Assembly. Several abstained. China abstained. Didn't vote with them, but abstained. India abstained. 7 countries abstained, I think it was the number. They're alone. And they did what they did, in my view. He did what he did because he thought he could split NATO, split Europe, and split the United States. We're going to demonstrate to the whole world, no one can split this country.
However, the outrage from the West disappears the further south you go. During the United Nations General Assembly resolution on Ukraine, 35 nations, including South Africa, China, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, abstained from the vote. India finds itself stuck. On the one hand, it is the only major ally of the United States that has failed to clearly condemn Russia's actions, while on the other hand, it is heavily dependent on Russia. More than 60% of India's weaponry comes from that country. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan called out the European Union for what he called double standards and the failure to condemn India when that country broke international law in Kashmir.
What do you think of us? Are we your slaves? Do you think that whatever you say we will do? EU ambassadors wrote a letter to us asking us to condemn and vote against Russia. I want to ask the EU ambassadors if they have written such a letter to India.
The divide between North and South is nothing new, but Russia's attack has highlighted a change in world power structures. Why is the refusal to condemn Russia by the global South being questioned? And will there be consequences for that neutrality? So we have gathered together a panel of experts in the alignment of a number of different Asian countries, where their allegiances lie and why. Let me introduce, first of all, out of New Haven, Connecticut, in the US, Fahd Humayun, political science PhD candidate at Yale University, specializing in the geopolitics of South Asia. We go to Washington, D.C., and they would see Michael Kugelman, Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center, and in London, Subhir Sinha, a reader in Theory and Politics of the Development at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Great to have you all on. Thanks very much indeed. It seems to be, Michael, if you aren't with us, this is the attitude of the West, then you're against us. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, certainly we've seen the Biden administration try to engage in some pretty intense diplomacy to get to much of the world to support the U.S. and the broader Western position on this war. Though I think that the U.S. at least has come around to accept the fact that naturally there are going to be a number of countries that are going to act according to their interests, and that could entail not operating in lockstep with the U.S. position on the war. And I think we see that in particular when it comes to the U.S. position on India, which it certainly does not agree with India's position, but I think that it grudgingly accepts it, and it hopes that India can work with the U.S. In other ways to try to help de-escalate this very serious crisis.
You see, well, I'm wondering whether, in fact, it is, as you put it, diplomacy, or whether, in fact, it is arm twisting stroke blackmail.
No, I definitely don't think it's that. I think that the Biden administration has been very realistic, for sure. And I think that in an ideal world, it would want not just the Western countries, but countries outside of the West and the developing world to side with the U.S. position. And I should say that if you look at the voting at the UN, particularly the vote at the General Assembly some days ago, it was a significant majority of UN members were voting in favor of the resolution condemning the invasion. And of course, there were several dozen countries, including four in South Asia, that decided to abstain. And indeed, I think that the US had tried with a number of those countries to try to get them to vote in favor of the resolution. But at the end of the day, the administration is going to accept the fact that not every country is going to be operating in lockstep with the United States. I'm not aware of any arm twisting or coercive tactics or anything like what you appear to be suggesting.
Subir, let me come to you, and then Fahd, you can answer this one as well. So, in that bit we played at the beginning where Biden was talking about the vote, he said they did what they did, those being the countries that did not support the resolution. They did what they did to split NATO and to split Europe. Is that at all the attitude of those countries who decided not to condemn Russia?
Well, I mean, from the Indian point of view, it seems to be that it is going to have 2 or 3 different levels. One, of course, is the domestic political calculations of Mr. Modi and his party, how this is going to play out for him, if he takes path A versus path B. But overall, I mean, there's a strong feeling that countries like India are being asked to take responsibilities without actually having been, quote unquote, rewarded for having been a part of the Western sort of not quite alliance, but set of support at the UN. But particularly for India, it is very important that they've been trying to get a good deal on petroleum. Mr. Modi doesn't really want to have massive inflation at home. And in terms of how this might look internationally, I think it's high stakes whichever way the Indian government goes, because at the moment, if they sort of go ahead with the sort of new payment program, tying the Indian rupee and the Russian ruble to the yuan, which is being reported within India today, then that will have costs. And we have seen a couple of prominent American journalists, Lou Dobbs, primarily, who's been asking for sanctions against India or the consideration of sanctions against India. So there is a kind of not yet coercive, but murmurs of possible coercive action, which will work out, I think, well for Modi domestically, but perhaps more disastrously for the Indian economy as a whole.
See, what I'm wondering is whether India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or whoever it happens to be is looking at what's happening in Ukraine and actually does not find it repugnant, because that seems to be the message that is being sent out at the moment. We don't mind what Russia's doing in Ukraine. It's really none of our business.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is a, feeling in general that international order has begun to crumble. No country in the West can point to countries like India or Pakistan or Bangladesh with respect to actions that they have taken or not taken, given the history of the last 25 odd years and issues of human rights and the universality of human rights already having come under considerable stress and question because of the selective application of the idea of human rights. We see that even happening right now with respect to Yemen or Palestine and things like that. What that does is that it allows for a lot of free agent type behavior by different countries, which will go their own way. So, for example, if it is the case that India has taken up the offer of reduced price sale of Russian petroleum products, and perhaps also for sunflower oil, then there is also obviously Germany, which has done the same and for a much larger quantity in terms of volume and value of the sale. So, in order for any country to then say for the Indian side that they should not have done that, would also mean to point fingers at key members of NATO and US allies who also seem to be doing similar kinds of inaction. So it isn't really a very clear division between action which is good and therefore countries that take it will be rewarded versus action that is bad and therefore countries that will take it will be punished, because either identical actions are being taken on both sides or some combination of a set of actions from one side can be seen also being taken by close allies of the US. And in a scenario in which there is no universal applicability of ideas such as human rights and so on, it just gives far too much leeway for countries to make decisions which are convenient not just for their national interest but also for the personal political interests of very shrewd leaders such as Modi.
I'm going to read out something now, Fahd, that comes from the founder and president of Imagine Africa, and then from Indonesia. The first one: neutrality does not mean indifference. Neutrality means continuously calling for the respect of international laws. Neutrality means that our hearts still go to the victims of military invasions and arbitrary sanctions never imposed on NATO countries. And this one from Indonesia: we will not blindly follow the steps taken by another country. How do you think, Fahd, Imran Khan, Prime Minister of Pakistan, one of the last leaders, if not the last leader, to visit Putin before the attack on Ukraine, how does he view his country's position?
Look, I think there are a couple of things at play here. One is that the two statements that you just read out. I think there's no shortage of countries in the global south that are a stranger to the destructiveness of global conflict. I think many countries in the global south perceive that there is a double standard in the kinds of wars and conflicts that elicit global sympathy and global attention and calls to action. And I think the conflict in Ukraine is, for many of these countries, laying bare some of these double standards.
Can I just ask you this? Therefore, do you think Pakistan's Prime Minister is almost saying, when he says, we are not your slaves, we're not going to do what you tell us to do immediately, is he sort of saying, well, hang on, because you've ignored us, you had this coming, and we really don't want to help you because you don't want to help us?
Well, look, there's a populist appeal to anti-Western rhetoric in Pakistan and in other countries that have been a victim of Western interventions. I think that's the context in which you need to understand Prime Minister Imran Khan's particular statement, which was a response to 22 European envoys, ambassadors, who wrote a letter asking Pakistan to condemn, Russia's actions in Afghanistan. Prime Minister Imran Khan was very much trying to tap into that anti-Western rhetoric. But I think at the same time, there's a very real set of geopolitical compulsions that's also at play in Pakistan's position here, which is that Pakistan has learned the hard way since the Cold War and since after the Cold War that it's very easy to become a casualty if you're a country like Pakistan in great power politics. Pakistan has also learned the hard way that because of its particular geostrategic position, neighboring Afghanistan, neighboring China, neighboring Iran and India, means that it really can't afford to sort of hem itself into one particular alliance or camp.
Michael, the suggestion seems to be that this doesn't mean that those people who refuse to condemn Russia do not have a heart. It's simply working on their own personal self-interest and their national self-interest.
Well, look, I think it's important to acknowledge that a number of the countries that abstained from the UN General Assembly resolution condemning the invasion were very transparent in the sense that they released they listed their justifications for their decision. And I think in the case of India, the Indian permanent representative to the UN listed or actually noted the idea that territoriality and sovereignty must be respected. It was vague, it didn't name names, it didn't get very specific, but clearly that was India's way of registering its own disapproval of the invasion. And I believe that Pakistan's government has made similar comments as well. I think it's very unlikely that any of the countries, whether in South Asia or elsewhere, that refuse to condemn the invasion, that means that they actually endorse it. Now, some would argue that that is the case, but I definitely do not think that's the case at all. No one benefits from this war, and I think a country like India, that would be particularly the case, given that a prolonged war means that Russia will likely draw closer to China and become dependent on China, which is not what India wants for its close Russian partner to become dependent on its biggest strategic rival, that being China. And of course, the longer the war goes on, you're going to have, there's a greater chance that the US and its like minded Western partners will be distracted from this effort to counter Chinese power in Asia, which is something that certainly does not serve India's interests well. So, bottom line is that very few countries other than Russia have an interest in a prolonged war in Ukraine. So I draw the line there. I think that just because a country refuses to condemn the war does not mean that that should be seen as a subtle form of endorsement of the invasion. I think there's a very sharp line that has to be drawn between the two.
I should add that we will be looking at China's position in a separate program. I know it's inevitably going to come up in this discussion, but I don't want people out there to think that we're actually ignoring China when in fact its position is absolutely vital. It's long-term position. Subir, is India then very worried about what might happen if it plays the wrong hand here?
Yes, before I get to that, if I can just pick up on a small point that Michael was raising, which was in terms of approval or not of the invasion of Ukraine. And it's actually and the statement that you read out. So a couple of things are interesting regarding that. You can see that comment regarding the respect for territorial integrity also addressed in two other directions. One, obviously, towards China, where India does not fully explicitly say, but everyone knows that China has entered into Indian territory. The second, of course, with respect to its desire for silence on its actions in Kashmir, where, of course, it also makes the argument regarding territorial integrity. As far as approval is concerned, if you follow the social media feed of people who are close to the Indian party in power, you will find that there are several who are explicitly pro-Putin, though they don't so much approve of the attack so much as they blame Ukraine for having brought it upon itself. India should be worried because its options are sort of limited, because if, as we hear, it is going into an alternative trading arrangement in which it is able to pay for Russian goods in rupees, and Russia can continue using the ruble, and that both will be tied to the yuan. That basically elevates the Chinese in a way that India would not necessarily like. Though I think that there are some people in the Indian establishment who seem to think a kind of a future Russia, China, India, Iran type arrangement. But if it goes down that way, then I think we'll have to consider very seriously the impact it's going to have with relation to the US. As far as Europe is concerned, India does have good relations, particularly with Mr. Macron, and in the UK, personally close relationship with the Prime Minister of the UK and Priti Patel and a number of other ministers. So, I mean, if you think of it in terms of blocks, then I think it is a risk. But if you think of the blocks themselves disintegrating, then I think the risk is considerably lower.
Fahd, what I'm hearing from all three of you, I think, is that, yes, there is a battle on the ground, and personally, these countries may not approve of what's going on, but in the longer term, what they're looking at is a battle for their place in a new world order.
No, absolutely. I think underlying the conflict in Ukraine and Russia's actions in Ukraine is a profound sense of unease about the future of multipolarity, and not just at a global level, but in Asia. You mentioned that, for instance, I know you're discussing China in a separate segment, but Pakistan's own relationship with China has undergone a significant deepening in the past 10 years. And that's a relationship too where Pakistan has tried to take a very clear position that its actions shouldn't be construed as a zero-sum choice. Pakistan is very clear in its foreign policy that even its relations with countries in the East and its countries with the West should not be construed as locking itself into one particular alliance camp. That's not something that a country like Pakistan really thinks that it can afford. Pakistan has been also trying to deepen its relationship with Russia, even though that comes with significant contradictions given the close defense and strategic partnership that Russia and India have enjoyed, and the hostile relationship between Pakistan and India. But I think there's a growing sense of pragmatism in Pakistan that Pakistan does need to diversify its portfolio of relationships, not just within the neighborhood, but within the broader sort of Asian theater.
Is there any kind of realpolitik in this when it comes to the human heart? Do you think Imran Khan would ever have felt it was his duty when standing next to President Putin, if not in public, then privately, to say to him, you cannot do this. This is the wrong thing to do. Innocent people will die. Or would he only have been thinking about Pakistan's place in the world and the country's bank balance and his position as Prime Minister?
I think the statements that Prime Minister Imran Khan has made on the crisis in Ukraine, as well as Pakistan's Foreign Office, have been fairly, I think, clear and unambiguous in the sense that Pakistan has called for a cessation of hostilities. Pakistan has called for a respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries involved. I think where Pakistan has sort of erred on the side of caution is outrightly criticizing Russia's actions. Now, I think it's important to remember that Prime Minister Imran Khan, for the past 2 years, has been a very sort of vocal champion of, the human rights in various parts of the world, but particularly calling on what's happening in parts of the world where Muslim populations are being oppressed. Prime Minister Imran Khan has tried to draw attention to the conflict in Kashmir, has tried to sort of draw international attention to this long simmering bilateral international dispute between India and Pakistan. I think the fact that that has been met with limited success, obviously, is not something that Prime Minister Imran Khan has been lost on Pakistan's leaders. And so there is very much this sense that, well, you're not paying attention to our problems when we raise our voices about Islamophobia, for instance, or the plight of Muslims in Kashmir or Palestine.
Make sure you maintain the same standards that you want us to maintain, and then we might support you. Michael, I was going to play in a clip here from somebody from the Philippines who basically says, don't expect us countries really to support the United States in the long term because, well, look at what the United States has done. So that's my summary rather than playing the whole clip. And my question is, the very fact that a number of countries have not condemned Russia's invasion, Biden says it was done to split NATO, and Europe says it hasn't done so, but has the West's position been weakened because of that lack of support, or did the United States and the others always expect that, and they're actually quite grateful that it isn't as big a vote against them as it might have been?
Well, I think that for the U.S., the biggest priority was that there be unity within the NATO alliance, because this was, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, this is a war that's on the perimeter of Europe, so to speak. And I think it was important for the Biden administration that the NATO countries and more broadly European countries be on the same page. And they are to an extent, but there is still some disagreement on the issue of sanctions, because, of course, many European countries continue to want to import energy from Russia. And there have been some efforts on the part of the EU countries to change their energy strategy so that they won't be as dependent on Russian energy, and so that they would be willing to support more full-fledged sanctions on Russia, including on its powerful energy sector. So I think that the fact that there has not been a consensus, an overwhelming consensus outside of the West, to take the position of the U.S. or the West, certainly it's problematic to an extent, but I don't think that's the big priority for the Biden administration. The key is to make sure that it's operating together with the other NATO countries, and this reflects a broader foreign policy goal of the Biden administration, that is to strengthen and restore alliances. The administration believes that the Trump administration had badly jeopardized NATO unity based on his own actions and things that he had said when he was president. So I think that in that sense, there's a success right there. Final point on this, though, if you look at all
if you don't mind, I want to bring Subir back in just because that is the last moment we have in the programme. Michael, thanks very much indeed. What would it take, Subir, for India's position to change? Anything?
For India's position to change in terms of actually supporting sanctions and voting for censure, I don't think that is going to happen. I mean, India's own position on human rights is highly cynical, and I'm sorry to say so is Pakistan's because of its silence on, Uyghur Muslims. We are living in a state of great cynicism about human rights. I don't think that there is a principled position any country can point to on human rights at the moment. And as far as NATO is concerned, we are looking at scenarios of great, close connections between the Russian hierarchy and the British political system, as well as close economic ties between Germany and Russia. So it is not the case that NATO has one voice in this. There are all kinds of different directions in which important member countries want to pull. And that is why I think the situation is the mess in which it is.
Okay.
That there is no clear-cut path ahead for any of the players that we have talked about. And all of them are basically looking to minimize their losses and trying to see what best they can get out of this conflict.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed to all three of you. It is like a muddled up ball of strings, so interconnected and very difficult to unravel. It's not about principles. It's about looking after yourself. From me, David Foster from the Roundtable team, we hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.